Well, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here with you today. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. I've got a counseling degree. I've worked as a hospital, hospice, home health chaplain. And so bereavement support is something I've done a lot of through the years. In fact, I'm coming to you today from British Columbia. I just attended Jan Jackson's funeral yesterday. I had a small part in that. I love Dan. He was the best man I ever worked for, quite frankly. He was a courageous man, and I grieve his loss. And so instead of being at home in Dallas, I'm in a hotel here in BC, getting a flight tomorrow to get back home, but happy to spend some time with you right now. I do believe that the entire world is grieving. COVID and war and everything else has left us in a perpetual state of grief. And I'm afraid that is as it's going to be. So let's take a look at a little bit about grief. I'm going to move on to the first slide here, the price of love. Grief is an experience reserved for those who love. Those who do not love do not grieve. We grieve greatly because we have loved greatly. And adding to that, the greater the love, the greater the loss, the greater the grief. But it's not just over person loss, as Lauren was mentioning earlier. We grieve over the loss of job, the loss of hopes, loss of dreams, financial loss. If a home burns down, there's a grief experience to that. If it washes away in a flood or in a landslide, you grieve over that loss. The loss of friendships, grief through a divorce is an horrific type of grief. In some ways, it's worse than anything else we go through. And so many other things that we go through. A miscarriage is another loss that people grieve. Stillbirth, it goes on and on. So anything that we love, anything that's near and dear to our personal identity, if it's lost, we have a grief experience. That includes health, mastectomy, amputation, it goes on. So it is an experience reserved for those who love. But if you don't love, you don't grieve. Our next slide is my greatest personal loss was Gail. Gail and I were married for 40 years, 3 months, 13 days, and 3 hours. When it's a significant loss, you tend to do silly things like that. You count the days, the hours, the years, everything else. We were married, she was still in college when I married her. She had a semester left. And we spent our lives together in ministry. We worked together. We taught together. We pastored churches. We did television together, traveled the world together, doing seminars. We created Mad About Marriage, a seminar that we did 121 times before her death. I've carried on with that and done it another 40 times, I think, after her demise. But her death was a huge blow to me. She died of pancreatic cancer, and it was a quick death. Her first symptom was on March 3 of 2016. We came to, ironically, to BC, to Vancouver, to do a Mad About Marriage, and I could tell something was wrong with her. She couldn't hold the microphone in her right hand, had to do it in her left hand. I kept wanting to take her to the hospital. She said, no, wait till we get home. And so it was March 4, 5, 6. It was 6 when we flew home, and I took her straight to the hospital. They took us in directly, and it took another week and a half of tests and everything else before they finally diagnosed stage 4 pancreatic cancer with large metastases to the liver. And at that point, they sent us home to die because they said, there's nothing we can do for you. She's going to die. And so we went home. I think it was March 18, we went home, and she died then on April 10. So it was not a very long time between diagnosis and death. But during those days at home, we were able to receive family and friends and say goodbye and help make some adjustment. But when she was gone, the grief hit me like a sledgehammer. And that it gave me the opportunity then to test the things I've been teaching. You know, we've all gone through grief, but this was such an horrific loss for me that it really put to test the things that I had been teaching. And I discovered that the literature, by and large, is pretty true. It's good stuff. What is grief? Let's take a look at that. There's a definition on the next slide. Grief is a multifaceted response to loss, particularly to loss of someone or something that has died, to which a bond or affection was formed. Although conventionally focused on the emotional response to loss, it also has physical, cognitive, behavioral, social, cultural, spiritual, and philosophical dimensions. And that is from no less an authority than Wikipedia, but I still think it's a good definition, so I took it nonetheless. It affects so many different things. Let's go on to the next slide here. We'll find normal grief reactions. You're one slide behind there. There we go, normal grief reactions. Things like, why do I feel out of control? I'm so glad it's over. And that's usually after a protracted loss. So in other words, if someone is ill for a very long time and trying to, you've got the ups and the downs with it, when finally that illness is over, there's an immediate relief, but followed later by the overwhelming experience of grief. I never knew it would hurt so bad. I feel as though it isn't real. I feel a tightness in my throat and heaviness in my chest. It's almost like you're constantly on the verge of tears. You know what's going to happen. And the heaviness in your chest, you find it difficult to breathe. That's why people who are grieving sigh deeply so often. It's not just a sigh of pain, but there's actually the attempt to get better oxygen to your lungs. So a deep sigh is something that happens quite often. My mood changes over the slightest things. You can cry over the death of germs in the mouthwash commercials. It surprises you. What is there left for me to live for? That's not necessarily suicidal thoughts, although for some people it is. But to have a loss of a purpose for your life is normal when perhaps the most significant thing in your life, the most significant relationship is gone. Then that was a big part of why you lived. Now we think, why am I here? What is there left for me to live for? Easily irritated. Sometimes I feel angry. Again, the next slide is I cry at unexpected times. I don't want others to see me when I feel sad. I can't concentrate. I sense my loved one's presence, like hearing their voice. And that's disconcerting to a lot of Adventists, but it's not spiritual harassment. This is basically normal. The subconscious is constantly looking for that which is lost. And so you might feel them in the room. You might think you hear their voice. I've seen Gail in crowds. I looked over and thought, surely that was her, and realized it wasn't. Your cognitive mind takes over and refutes what your subconscious is hoping for. Feel like my mind is on a merry-go-round that will not stop. One of the most frequent things I hear from people in grief is, am I losing my mind? Have I gone crazy? And the answer is no, you're grieving. I have trouble sleeping. I don't feel hungry, or I feel hungry all the time. You can usually one extreme or the other, or you can go back and forth. At times I would just had no desire for food, and other times I was a grief eater. Man, I could eat everything in sight. I miss being touched. This is true, especially if you slept with this individual and you roll over and there's nothing there. I had one woman who let her Saint Bernard sleep in the bed with us, so when she rolled over, she did something warm. It's a big deal. I miss having someone to help me make decisions. That's really a difficult thing to go through. It's a difficult thing to find yourself needing to make financial decisions, needing to make decisions about career or family or future. Is tough. Initial symptoms of grief, these usually last 4 to 6 months. You think about shock, denial, anger, detachment and withdrawal, inability to think, confusion, and guilt. Guilt is an interesting one, and most of the time this is false guilt. One woman said, I should have known it was cancer. I said, how many people did you take him to? Well, 6 doctors, but I'm a nurse. I should have known, and I'm his wife. So, well, that's unrealistic. It took 6 doctors to diagnose this, and yet somehow you as a nurse and his wife should have known. That's false guilt. But there are also times when people have guilt over things you said or did or didn't say or didn't do, and that can complicate the mourning. if it was a broken relationship with no resolution to that. Now, there are some symptoms that you have. Delayed responses to grief, 6 months to 2 years is what we usually think about this on the next slide. Loneliness, sadness, emptiness, searching for them, searching for meaning, fear. People who lose someone usually have a fear of another loss or a fear of your own death. Those are frightening things. Weeping, you weep constantly at times. Sighing, I mentioned that before. Fatigue, easily tired. Chest pain. Some people mistake it for heart problems, but it really, the pain is so palpable, you just feel it in your chest. Jealousy. Sometimes this is over people who seem to be having the life that you thought you would have. Shortly after Gail's death, I took a trip to Florida where I was speaking, and I took a meal in a restaurant, and in Orlando especially, where I was, everybody and his dog seems to be going to Disney, and I sat there and looked at an older couple with obviously their grandchildren with them, and the Mickey Mouse and Minnie Mouse ears gave it away that they had been to Disneyland with their grandchildren. And that's something that Gail and I planned to do with our grandchildren. We were saving up miles and points we're going to take them. And I felt jealous over this couple who was doing what we had planned to do, but didn't get a chance to do. They were at Disney World enjoying their grandkids, having a lot of fun. And I didn't get to do that. So jealousy in that respect. Memory loss, especially short-term memory, very common. One woman told me she was sitting in a room doing something, realized she needed something in the next room to accomplish that task. So she went into the next room, could not remember why she'd come in there, what it was she went after. And so she turned around to go back where she was before and realized that, well, she couldn't remember where she had been or what she was doing at the time, and thought she was losing her mind. It's not uncommon to have those experiences. And then simply an inability to concentrate. The details are just almost impossible. And concentrating for more than 3 to 5 minutes just seems to be a loss. It's just ridiculous to try. Let's go to the next slide. We got Kubler-Ross has identified the stages of dying and grief. Her work has really been seminal in our understanding of the grief process. She got Americans and really the world talking about death and dying. And the problem with her model is that so many people have said that you go through these in order and you go through every stage, and that simply is not true. Not only is it not true, but in interviewing David Kessler, her protege, who authored books with her and continues to speak on grief and loss. He's probably one of the world's leading authorities on it right now. He said that she didn't intend for it to be seen sequential, nor was it to be that everyone would have every experience with this, every stage. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance are the 5 stages. Kessler has recently written a book adding with the acceptance of the Kubler-Ross Foundation a 6th stage, and that is finding meaning. And so that is the model that most of the world has worked with. But again, with Gail's loss, I never denied it, never had anger, didn't bargain. I was thoroughly depressed, acceptance, and eventually found meaning and new purpose in life. So I have not used this model much simply because I find problems with it simply because of the misunderstanding that most of us have regarding this model. It was not intended to be as it is used. So I'll share with you in a moment a different model that was helpful for me. Next slide talks a little bit about the timeline of grief. The average time for active grief is normally 10 months to 2 years. Although studies have shown that significant progress may be made in 9 to 10 months for some people. For most, you think 1 to 2 years is more of an appropriate measurement. But even then, as the next point says, it's not impossible to grieve actively from 3 to 5 years without being pathological with your grief. And so my comment on that is your grief. Don't allow anyone to force a timeline on you. I encourage you to be gentle with yourself. Your experience will be different than anyone else's experience. So don't let someone try to dictate what your experience will look like. And as I went through my own grief, and very publicly, I discovered that everyone's got an opinion, and opinions are like armpits. Everybody's got a couple of them, and most all of them stink. So I tried not to allow people's opinion to have much sway with me. And some of the things people say are just incredibly stupid, and some of them really mean well, but not all of them. After I remarried, I was at a church doing a series of meetings, and Pam was with me. And some dear, sweet little saint came up to me and she said, I see that your wife died. I said, yes, ma'am. She passed away. She said, well, my husband died too. And I said, I'm so sorry to hear that. She said, I see you've remarried. I said, yes, ma'am, I have. She said, I have not. Well, I said, well, it's not for everyone, is it? She said, all I know is resurrection morning, when he comes forward from the grave, we're not going to be confused. And I thought, well, how lovely. Thank you for sharing that. And she was not satisfied in telling me off this way. She found Pam and told her the same thing. So not everyone who has an opinion about your loss is going to, what they say will be well-intentioned. Some are and others are not. And some of what the well-intentioned people say are actually quite painful, it's hurtful. Let's go on to the next slide, and that is simply tell your story. One of the most important things you can do is to tell the story of your relationship with what it is that you've lost. And I add the caveat that remembering is a sacred act. Whenever Israel faced some new task, some new challenge, an inspirational leader would stand up and remind them of the ways God had blessed them in the past. And that was a way of giving them courage and hope for the future. I believe that remembering is important. Jesus says, remember the Sabbath day, forget not your Creator in the days of your youth. Remember, I'm the Lord your God who delivers you, who sanctifies you. So we're called to remember. And I believe that remembering is a sacred act. And so it's important to think the thoughts, but also to tell the stories. There are significant stories in your life in association with the person you've lost. Telling those stories not only is therapeutic for you, but it helps share values that perhaps the stories teach. It instructs others, and it gives others a good pattern for what it means to live your life well, and to learn from the positive and the negative experiences that you've had with other people. So storytelling is just extremely important. Now, here's a different model, the model that I used. And I refer to these as 4 signposts for the model. Basically, when you've lost something, you find yourself in a new place in your life, and we'll call that disorganization. And you have to get from point A, disorganization, to point B, reorganization. And the only vehicle you have to make that journey is grief. And grief is an old beat up Ford with about 400,000 miles on it. It needs a ring job. The tires are bald, and it will reach 35 miles an hour going downhill with a good stiff wind at your back. So it's really a bad vehicle, but it's the only vehicle you've got. You got to take the back roads. And so a lot of switchbacks and ups and downs. But the idea is to get from this place of disorganization, where the old answers don't fit the new questions any longer, to the place of reorganization, where you understand the new questions and you've got new answers for them, and you make sense of your life. And along the way of this journey, there are 4 mile markers. The first is to believe that it really happened. You cannot grieve a loss you do not accept. You cannot grieve a loss that you don't believe actually took place. And so you have to believe that it happened. Now, that is more significant than you might think, because some people try to live in the land of denial, and they can do so significantly that they can actually do psychological damage. When I was a hospital chaplain, a man came in and died there at the ER, and I brought his wife back to view him, and I could tell she was not really dealing well with this. And as I explored, I realized that she thought that he was just sleeping and would get up and they would go home. And I tried to tell her otherwise. No, she disagreed with me. So I brought a doctor in, shared with him what was going on. And he went through every physical test he could think of to demonstrate to her that this man was dead. We were determined not to let her leave the ER until she knew her husband was dead. And that almost seems cruel, but there are some studies showing that if you stay in that stronger denial for up to 6 weeks, you may never come back. And so we felt it was essential that we demonstrate to her the fact that her husband was not going home with her, that he was dead, and that this was permanent. And so everything from putting a mirror beneath his nose to feeling for a pulse to sticking a pin in him to evoke a response, to look for reflexes, and finally she began to awaken to the fact that her husband was dead. Again, as cruel as that seemed, it was a very necessary step for her. So be willing to believe that it happened. The second thing is to be willing to experience the pain. And that seems counterintuitive because we avoid pain at all costs. But the only way through grief is in fact through it. You can't go over it, around it. You can't work it out, deny it, out medicate it, out drink it. You can't do any of those things. You can't out spiritualize it. It will hit you. And so you have to experience that pain. It's inevitable. You must go through this. And the rule of thumb for grieving is the sooner and the more intensely you pain, the sooner you make the adjustments. The next step, the next mile marker is to adjust to familiar environments associated with the person you lost. And some of this happens immediately. If you slept with this person, then you're sleeping in an empty bed. If this is the person who cooked, then all of a sudden you've either got to cook or you've got to go out to eat. Something's got to change. Everything from paying the bills to taking out the garbage, to learning to go to church without this individual, to going to family functions, to not having someone to call when something good or something bad happens. Those are the daily adjustments we have to make to the fact that now this person, this thing, this event, this memory, this hope is no longer with us. So those daily adjustments to what you have lost. The last step is one that is difficult to go through, and a lot of people are upset with me when I express this one to them. But that is to say goodbye to the relationship that you once had with the person that can now no longer exist. And then eventually withdraw that emotional energy and reinvest it in something else. Notice I didn't say goodbye to your memories or your love. You can't and you shouldn't. But the relationship has changed because it used to be here and now. You could touch one another, you could talk to one another, you could email, but that is no longer a possibility. And so that relationship as it used to exist is gone. It is over. Now a new relationship exists in your mind, in your heart, your memories, a new relationship that you must now embrace. I was a senior chaplain at Hughley Hospital in Fort Worth, Texas, which was owned by the Seventh-day Adventist. And one of my responsibilities was to teach classes in grief recovery for the community. And we had, I think it's 5 or 6 week classes I would teach. And they became pretty popular. We had 80 to 100, maybe 120 people coming to those. And it was too big a group for me to get to know everyone who was there. But I noticed that one session, there was a woman who came who looked like young enough to be a mother. And she was extremely distraught and at times even looked angry. But toward the end of the sessions, she began to find some improvement. The next quarter, and I did these groups once a quarter, the next quarter she was back, but now she was sitting with someone that I did not know. And they sat together and she provided comfort for this individual. The next quarter, yet another person she sat with and provided support for. And this went on with different people coming to the session that she was sitting with. So finally, I made a beeline for her and had to get her story. The story was that she had 2 sons. The older one was a daddy's boy, but the younger one was a mama's boy. And this mama's boy loved to be with her. And he was 4 years old. And one of the things he loved to do was to sit on the counter with her in the kitchen when it was time for her to make banana muffins. And he would crack the eggs for that. And he was good at it and could do it without getting shells in the eggs. And so that was their routine. But one day he was outside playing with his older brother, and she wanted to make the banana muffins. He wasn't there, so she went ahead and made them without him. When he came in, he could smell them and realized what was going on, and was very upset that she made banana muffins without him. And so she apologized and promised that the next time he can make muffins with her. It was shortly after that that he had the accident that took his life. And her grief was just huge. She was not dealing well with it. Someone made her come to grief recovery, and she was not doing well with it. And when I said that one of the goals was to say goodbye to the relationship, she wanted to tear my face off. She was so upset with me, and I will never do that, she said. She didn't tell me that, but inside that's what she was thinking and experiencing. But she still was stuck. And as the weeks went by and the classes continued, she finally, one night, was up in the middle of the night, could not sleep, extremely distraught, crying. And so she walked into the kitchen and, without thinking about it, started making banana muffins. And when she got to the part where she was cracking eggs, it dawned on her. The story came back. She realized that this was supposed to be his time to make these muffins with her. And she cried. She was just distraught. And finally, in desperation, she looked up to the heavens. She said, "Johnny, I love you with all my heart. I always will. You will always be my little boy. But I guess on the face of this earth as we know it, I will never again make banana muffins with you. So I got to say goodbye to that part of our friendship, our relationship. Goodbye, Johnny." And she cried profusely after that, just a torrent of tears. But it was that event which began to make the improvements. And slowly she said goodbye to other aspects of the relationship. And then once she felt that there was a measure of healing, she said now that anytime there's a loss in her church, in her community, in her neighborhood, she waits until everyone else leaves. And then she makes banana muffins and she puts them in a basket and she takes them to the door and she says, "Here's a gift for you. And there's a story behind the gift. And when you're ready, I'll tell it to you." And when they're ready, not only does she tell them the story of Johnny, but she takes them with her to every session of the grief recovery programs. She's there with them. So she took that most difficult tragedy of her life and turned it into something good. But she didn't start to turn that corner until she took seriously the idea that she had to say goodbye to the relationship as it used to be. Those are the 4 goals for grief. Go to the next slide, if you would, please. There are activities now to engage in to help motor this. And even if you forget everything else about this presentation, if you will do these 4 things, chances are excellent that you will grieve appropriately. Think, take a trip down memory lane through the house or other areas that remind you of the deceased person. Think the thoughts fully when they come, positive and negative thoughts. Think, don't try to stuff it out of your brain. Your brain needs to process this. Write. Keep a journal, write about your feelings, tell your stories. That's the only thing I could write about after Gail's loss. And I wrote blogs that I posted on Facebook, and I had thousands of people reading those things. So I encourage people to write, talk. Details should be told over and over again, but you need to express feelings too. Talk about the immediate loss, move back to your total relationship with the person, express the deep feelings, even those that may be negative. Because not every relationship is all sunlight and roses. Sometimes there are negative things there too. Talk about all of it, tell the stories, and then weep. Don't hold back the tears. It is absolutely therapeutic to cry. If you'll engage in those 4 processes, it will help motor the journey from point A to point B. And chances are you're going to grieve appropriately. If you forget everything else, you just engage in those 4 things, you'll probably do all right. Most people do. Next slide says there is a rule of thumb. The rule of thumb for grief is the sooner you engage in intense grief, the sooner you get better. The longer you wait, the longer it takes. So intense early grieving is the best course. It's not a course that everyone can engage in, but it is the best course. The next slide adds a little concept that I engaged in. I took that rule of thumb seriously in my life, and I engaged in leaning into the pain. This, to me, grief is a bully, and it will slap you when you least expect it. It will assault you. and jump up and drive you crazy. So I don't like that. I don't like being victimized. So I tried to hit the first blow. That means that I made a list of the things that I knew would be difficult to do. And I knew eventually I have to do those things, but I chose to do them earlier rather than later. I chose to do them on my timeline, in my way. I could prepare for them and make some provision for me if I needed an escape of some sort. But I engaged in those things earlier. Preaching was one of them. I did that a month and a half after Gail's death. I did one of my 7 camp meetings that summer, a month and a half. The first camp meeting it was to do canceled on me, but 7 of them they held in there just in case, and they had backup speakers. But I went to that first camp meeting and I preached there, and it was the most difficult thing I've ever done, but I got through it. The other thing that we did, we used to take vacations to New York City, and we would take cruises. And in New York, we'd like to go to a Broadway show, and there's a restaurant we ate at just off Times Square. So I took that vacation like 2.5 months after her death, and I cried through the whole thing. I got the hotel room. I booked a Broadway show. It was a musical comedy, and I cried through the whole thing. And then I went to eat in our favorite restaurant afterwards, and I sat there crying. And so, but the truth is that doing that claimed New York City for me again. And I've been able to go back now. It's mine. It's not just ours, it's mine. And I leaned into that pain. I did the same thing with a cruise. I took a cruise by myself, because that's another thing we used to love to do. And I claimed that for myself. There are certain things that you can anticipate and you can choose to do in your own way. Now, I always tell people, if you do this, make sure that you have a gracious escape, that you have the ability to leave if it gets to be too much for you. And of all the things I did, I think there's only once that I took that route where I said, this is a little too much, and I left. But other than that, I chose to lean into the pain early, so as to help facilitate the process. And there's some studies show that actually, if you can do this, that your adjustment will come actually earlier. It's not everyone can do it. Not everyone should do it. I'm not telling you this is what you have to do. It's what I did. And I think that it helped facilitate my process. That pretty much concludes the presentation I wanted to make. This is one part of a nearly 3-hour seminar that my wife and I teach. And then in addition to that, I've created a small group curriculum that churches and civic groups can use in order to help support your community. It's called the Grief Sessions. And that's sold by Adventist and by Faith for Today. I also wrote a book on my experience with Gail, and it's entitled Tears to Joy, One Man's Journey Through Grief. And that's available at Adventist book centers or also at Faith for Today if you had an interest in that as well. You go through a bad thing like this, and part of my recovery was to create resources that would help others go through it as well. This is an inescapable part of life. Everyone grieves, everyone has losses. And so you're not immune to it, nor am I. It is a part of what life is about, unfortunately. And so hopefully these resources will be of value to you. And what I've shared here has primarily been focused on personal loss, but the same principles apply to every other loss of your life. And again, we've already listed a variety of those kinds of things that are losses. I'll add one caveat to that, and that is that the church is not particularly good at dealing with certain losses, especially not the loss of divorce. We stink at it. Some places we do a little bit better when it comes to personal loss, but I think our culture in general is not good with loss, and we don't deal with it well. So hopefully a little education can help us know that it's all right to cry, that tears are therapeutic, that they are not a sign of weakness, nor are they a sign of spiritual weakness. that Jesus wept, and so too can we. And it's all a part of that journey. So that ends my presentation.